Alright, let's keep this party rolling with A Tale of Two Cities, Book the First, Chapter 6, which I'm sure all of you are going to be super pleased to know is the last chapter in Book the First. Not to depress you, but then I think there are 24 chapters in Book the Second, so ha 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 ha, joke's on you. Okay, so, the Shoemaker, which, because you just finished Chapter 5, you should know the Shoemaker is Dr. Manet. Good day, said Monsieur Defarge, looking down at the white head that bent low over the shoemaking. It was raised for a moment, and a very faint voice responded to the salutation, as if it were at a distance. Good day. You are still hard at work, I see. After a long silence, the head was lifted for another moment, and the voice replied, Yes, I am working. This time a pair of haggard eyes had looked at the questioner before the face had dropped again. The faintness of the voice was pitiable and dreadful. It was not the faintness of physical weakness, though confinement and hard fare no doubt had their part in it. Its deplorable peculiarity was that it was the faintness of solitude and disuse. It was like the last feeble echo of a sound made long, long ago. So entirely had it lost the life and the resonance of the human voice that it affected the senses like once beautiful color faded away into a poor weak stain. So sunken and suppressed it was that it was like a voice underground. So expressive it was of a hopeless and lost creature, that a famished traveler, wearied out by lonely wandering in a wilderness, would have remembered home and friends in such a tone before lying down to die. This description of his voice is heartbreaking. His voice is really weak. It's pitiable, it's dreadful, it's so faint. And it's not the faintness of being physically weak, of having been in prison so long that you're physically ill, even though I'm sure that had some part to do with it, is what Dickens says. But it's the faintness of a voice that has been in solitary so long, it's forgotten how to make sounds. He's been alone so long, his voice doesn't even register human voice anymore. It's like a song that's just echoed, and it's like that very last echo. So it's just faded, 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 faded. Like a beautiful color that's just a weak stain now, but had once been so beautiful. Some minutes of silent work had passed, and the haggard eyes had looked up again, not with any interest or curiosity, but with a dull, mechanical perception beforehand that the spot where the only visitor they were aware of had stood was not yet empty. So he looks up, not because he's like wanting to make conversation or see anybody, but he's just almost surprised that the person who was talking to him before is still there. It's kind of like the why aren't you gone yet look. I want, said Defarge, who had not removed his gaze from the shoemaker, to let in a little more light here. You can bear a little more? The shoemaker stopped his work, looked with a vacant air of listening at the floor to one side of him, then, similarly, looked at the floor on the other side of him, then upward at the speaker. What did you say? You can bear a little more light? I must bear it if you let it in, laying the palest shadow of a stress upon the second word. The must, right? The must is the second word, like, I've got to do this. There's still a little piece of him, like what he used to be, a little fire in there, kind of, almost. The opened half door was opened a little further, and secured at that angle for the time. A broad ray of light fell into the garret, and showed the workman with an unfinished shoe upon his lap, pausing in his labor. His few common tools and various scraps of leather were at his feet and on his bench. He had a white beard raggedly cut, but not very long, a hollow face, and exceedingly bright eyes. The hollowness and thinness of his face would have caused them to look large, under his yet dark eyebrows and his confused white hair, though they had been really otherwise. But they were naturally large, and looked unnaturally so. Okay, Dickens likes to use words, so this is him just using a lot of words. So he's saying that because his face is so thin, his eyes look excessively large. He normally has big eyes anyway. And we associate big eyes like with innocence, in a way. So they look unnaturally large. His yellow rags of shirt lay open at the throat and showed his body to be withered and worn. He and his old canvas frock and his loose stockings and all his poor tatters of clothes had, in a long seclusion from direct light and air, faded down to such a dull uniformity of parchment yellow that it would have been hard to say which was which. He had put up a hand between his eyes and the light, and the very bones of it seemed transparent. So he sat, with a steadfastly vacant gaze, pausing in his work. He never looked at the figure before him, without first looking down on this side of himself, then on that, as if he had lost the habit of associating place with sound. He never spoke, without first wandering in this manner, and forgetting to speak. Manet is based on real prisoners, on the observation of real prisoners who've been in solitary confinement so long. This description just rips your soul out. It's like he forgets where people is. He can't look anyone in the eye. He looks to this side, to that side, as if he doesn't really realize where sound is coming from. Maybe it's from his own head. He doesn't even know anymore. It's crushing. "Are you going to finish that pair of shoes today?" asked Defarge, motioning to Mr. Lorry to come forward. "What did you say?" "Do you mean to finish that pair of shoes today?" "I can't say that I mean to. I suppose so. I don't know." But the question reminded him of his work, and he bent over it again. Mr. Lorry came silently forward, leaving the daughter by the door. When he had stood, for a minute or two, by the side of Defarge, the shoemaker looked up. He showed no surprise at seeing another figure, but the unsteady fingers of one of his hands strayed to his lips as he looked at it. His lips and his nails were of the same pale lead color, and then the hand dropped to his work, and he once more bent over the shoe. The look and the action had occupied but an instant. So he's working for minutes before he even realizes there's anyone else in the room, and they're just staring at him. Like, they don't know what else to do, so they're just staring at this poor man. And finally, Manet looks up, and he sees someone else next to Defarge, and you notice he takes that hand and he puts it to his mouth. Like, it almost suggests like he kind of, sort of, in the depths of his soul, almost recognizes Lorry, but then it's gone. And he goes back to his shoe. "You have a visitor, you see," said Monsieur Defarge. "What did you say?" "Here is a visitor." The shoemaker looked up as before, but without removing a hand from his work. "Come," said Defarge. "Here is Monsieur, who knows a well-made shoe when he sees one. Show him that shoe you are working on. Take it, Monsieur." Mr. Lorry took it in his hand. "Tell Monsieur what kind of shoe it is, and the maker's name." There was a longer pause than usual before the shoemaker replied, "I forgot what it was you asked me. What did you say?" "I said, couldn't you describe the kind of shoe for Monsieur's information?" "It is a lady's shoe. It is a young lady's walking shoe. It is in the present mode. I never saw the mode. I have had a pattern in my hand." He glanced at the shoe with some little passing touch of pride. "And the maker's name?" said Defarge. Now that he had had no work to hold, he laid the knuckles of the right hand in the hollow of the left, and then the knuckles of the left hand in the hollow of the right, and then passed a hand across his bearded chin, and so on in regular changes, without a moment's intermission. The task of recalling him from the vacancy into which he always sank when he had spoken was like recalling some very weak person from a swoon, or endeavoring, in the hope of some disclosure, to stay the spirit of a fast-dying man. So Defarge is like, what kind of shoe is it? And Manet, well, at first he says shoe and name. And it takes Manet so long, because it's the name that catches him, right? That he forgets to answer. He's like, what'd you ask? And so Defarge, he slows it down. He simplifies. And he says, what kind of shoe is it? And Manet says it's a young lady's shoe in the current fashion. That's what present mode means, in the current fashion. And, I mean, use your brain. You know why he's making a young lady's shoe. He knew his wife was pregnant. He probably knew he had a little girl on the way or something, right? He at least assumes, so he's making a shoe that would fit his daughter's current foot. It just makes me want to cry so much. And then Defarge is like, and who made that shoe? And it takes him a while. He's so nervous. He's so used to just going back to his shoes when he's uncomfortable. And he doesn't have a shoe to hold, so he like squishes one hand, then he squishes the other hand, then he puts it on his face, and he just goes back and forth, back and forth. It's this nervous, almost insane man's kind of twitch, and it's so sad. Did you ask me for my name? Assuredly I did. 105 North Tower. Is that all? 105 North Tower. With a wary sound that was not a sigh, nor a groan, he bent to work again, until the silence was again broken. Manet doesn't know his name anymore. He's 105 North Tower. That's the cell he was imprisoned in. That's what you would refer to a prisoner by. He didn't have a name in jail. So for 18 years, he's been locked up, and he's just 105 North Tower. Which, on a historical note, because it was all about the history here, the Bastille had, I believe, 8 towers. There were actually 2 North Towers in its construction, so Dickens makes a little slip in his historical accuracy here by only saying 105 North Tower and not making a distinction between the two. But we can forgive him for that because the Bastille was destroyed, ripped apart, physically gone, by 1789. Like in one of the revolutions after it, they were like, and it's done. Like, we do not need the symbol of just repression and torture and just everything that the Bastille represented. They take it apart. There's no vestige of it left. There is like a tiny little piece of one column that they found after excavating for the subway system, the Paris Metro. But that's it. It's moved 100 yards away from where the Bastille was. When I went to Paris, I was really keyed up because, I didn't know my history when I visited. And I was like, ooh, I'm going to get to see the Bastille, being an idiot like I was back then. And I went and I was like, there's no Bastille here. There's this giant column they built. It's called the July Column. Well, it translates to the July Column. And it's built on the spot where the Bastille was, but there's no Bastille. There's nothing there except the July Column. And the only thing I saw on the street was there's a plaque kind of outlaying where the Bastille was built, and it just says the Bastille used to be here. Wow, I was so disappointed. But, that's life. So, yeah, 105 North Tower. You are not a shoemaker by trade, said Mr. Lorry, looking steadfastly at him. His haggard eyes turned to Defarge as if he would have transferred the question to him. But as no help came from that quarter, they turned back on the questioner when they had sought the ground. I am not a shoemaker by trade? Look, it's a question. He doesn't remember. It takes him a second. No, I was not a shoemaker by trade. I learned it here. I taught myself. I asked leave to... He lapsed away, even for minutes, wringing those measured changes on his hands the whole time. His eyes came slowly back, at last, to the face from which they had wandered. When they rested on it, he started and resumed, in the manner of a sleeper, that moment awake, reverting to a subject of last night. I asked leave to teach myself, and I got it with much difficulty after a long while, and I have made shoes ever since. As he held out his hand for the shoe that had been taken from him, Mr. Lorry said, still looking steadfastly in his face, Monsieur Manet, do you remember nothing of me? The shoe dropped to the ground, and he sat looking fixedly at the questioner. So he doesn't remember who he is. And he says, yeah, I wasn't a shoemaker originally. Like, it comes back to him. He says, I asked permission to make shoes. It's like the one thing that let him stay alive in prison, like gave him something to do. So he became, instead of a doctor, a shoemaker. And then he wants his shoe back. He wants to end this conversation, get his shoe back, and just go back to what he knows and what he's comfortable with. And Laurie, he just can't take it. He's staring him straight in the face, steadfastly. He's like, and he says his name, Monsieur Manet. And the shoemaker holding that shoe, it's like shock. He just drops it. Push. Monsieur Manet. Mr. Lorry laid his hand upon Defarge's arm. Do you remember nothing of this man? Look at him. Look at me. Is there no old banker, no old business, no old servant, no old time rising in your mind, Monsieur Manet? As the captive of many years sat looking fixedly, by turns, at Mr. Lorry and Defarge, some long obliterated marks of an actively intent intelligence in the middle of the forehead gradually forced themselves through the black mist that had fallen on him. They were overclouded again. They were fainter. They were gone. But they had been there. So there's a moment. There's just a moment where he seems to recognize them. It goes away, but it was there. It was there. And so exactly was the expression repeated on the fair young face of her who had crept along the wall to a point where she could see him, and where she now stood looking at him, with hands which at first had been only raised in frightened compassion, if not even to keep him off and shut out the sight of him, but which were now extending towards him, trembling with eagerness to lay the spectral face upon her warm young breast, and to love it back to life and hope. So exactly was the expression repeated, though in stronger characters, on her fair young face, that it looked as though it had passed like a moving light from him to her. So if you forgot Lucy was in the room, guess what? She's not. And she's out of that just like shocked terror. She's snapped out of her whole I'm about to pass out mode, and she sees her dad, and she's moved to compassion. All she wants to run up there and grab him and hug him and cradle him to her the way a mother would cradle a child whenever it was sad and upset and needed comforting. She wants to comfort him. She wants to bring it back to life and hope. Bring it back to life, recalled to life. She's the one doing the recalling to life. She's the book 2, the golden thread. She is it. She's what holds everything together. Darkness had fallen on him in its place. He looked at the two, less and less attentively, and his eyes in gloomy abstraction sought the ground and looked about him in the old way. Finally, with a deep, long sigh, he took the shoe up and resumed his work. Have you recognized him, monsieur? Asked Defarge in a whisper. Because remember, Laurie is there to actually recognize him and make sure it's him and all of that as far as like the bank and everything is concerned. Yes. For a moment. At first I thought it quite hopeless, but I have unquestionably seen, for a single moment, the face that I once knew so well. Hush. Let us draw further back. Hush. She had moved from the wall of the garret, very near to the bench on which he sat. There was something awful in his unconsciousness of the figure that could have put out its hand and touched him as he stooped over his labor. Not a word was spoken. Not a sound was made. She stood like a spirit, like a guardian angel, beside him, and he bent over his work. I mean, imagine, it's just like one of those paintings where you have somebody bent over something and there's an angel standing over them so close but that person is completely oblivious. That is what that scene looks like. Lucy is just bent over him. It happened, at length, that he had occasion to change the instrument in his hand for his shoemaker's knife. It lay on that side of him, which was not the side on which she stood. He had taken it up and was stooping to work again, when his eyes caught the skirt of her dress. He raised them and saw her face. The two spectators started forward, but she stayed them with a motion of her hand. She had no fear of his striking at her with the knife, though they had. So, I mean, he doesn't even realize she's there, right? And he reaches for that knife to keep making his shoes, and he sees her skirt. And it's unusual. It's not like you see that in prison. And so it catches his attention, and he looks up at her. And Laurie and Defarge, who had been standing farther back, get really scared, and they start running towards her, like, oh, no, he's got a knife. And she stops him. She holds up her hand like a stop sign. It's like, stop. Because she has no fear of this man. He stared at her with a fearful look, and, after a while, his lips began to form some words, though no sound proceeded from them. So his lips are just moving, but nothing's coming out. By degrees, in the pauses of his quick and labored breathing, he was heard to say, "What is this?" Look, he's breathing quick. He wasn't breathing quick before. Like, the flutter in the heart, the kind of nervousness. Do you remember in the dream where he got anxious? It's kind of like that. He's getting anxious in real life. And this is the scene where Lucy, as much as she annoys me in places, she totally redeems herself, and she totally earns the title of heroine of the novel and angel and perfection and all that stuff. Like, she gets it. She earns it. What is this? With the tears streaming down her face, she put her two hands to her lips and kissed them to him, then clasped them on her breast as she laid his ruined head there. "You are not the jailer's daughter," she sighed. "No. Who are you?" Not yet trusting the tones of her voice, she sat down on the bench beside him. He recoiled, but she laid her hand upon his arm. A strange thrill struck him when she did so, and visibly passed over his frame. He laid the knife down softly as he sat staring at her. Her golden hair, which she wore in long curls, had been hurriedly pushed aside and fell down over her neck. Advancing his hand by little and little, he took it up and looked at it. In the midst of the action, he went astray, and with another deep sigh, fell to work at his shoemaking. It's her hair, it's her hair. He sees it and he's like, ah! And then he gets distracted and goes back to the shoe. Like, 'cause every time he gets anxious, he kind of goes back to that shoemaker mode, because that's what keeps him safe. But not for long. Releasing his arm, she laid her hand upon his shoulder. After looking doubtfully at it 2 or 3 times, as if to be sure it was really there, he laid down his work, put his hand to his neck, and took off a blackened string with a scrap of folded rag attached to it. He opened this carefully on his knee, and it contained a very little quantity of hair, not more than 1 or 2 long golden hairs which he had, in some old day, wound off upon his finger. He took her hair into his hand again, and looked closely at it. "It's the same? How can it be? When was it? How was it?" As the concentrating expression returned to his forehead, he seemed to become conscious that it was in hers too. He turned her full to the light and looked at her. She had laid her head upon my shoulder. That night, when I was summoned out, she had a fear of my going, though I had none. And when I was brought to the North Tower, they found these upon my sleeve. You will leave me then? They can never help me to escape in the body, though they may in spirit. Those were the words I said. I remember them very well. He formed this speech with his lips many times before he could utter it. But when he did find spoken words for it, they came to him coherently, though slowly. How was this? Was it you? Which, please understand, it wasn't her. She wasn't even born when he went to the Bastille. So, who was it? Ding! It was her mom. Whenever they summoned him out, right before he walked out the door, his wife hugged him, and, as happens, some of her hair stayed on his clothes. He wasn't afraid of going, but she was. And then he gets thrown in jail. He wasn't expecting it. Whenever they throw him in jail, he asks them if he can keep her hair. They're like, he'll never escape using her hair physically, but maybe mentally they would give him a moment or two of peace, because he could daydream of her. And the mom's hair and Lucy's hair are exactly the same. That's how he recognizes her, that golden thread. Once more this two spectators started, and he turned upon her with a frightful suddenness. But she sat perfectly still in his grasp, and only said in a low voice, I entreat you, good gentlemen, do not come near us. Do not speak, do not move. Hark! He exclaimed. Whose voice was that? His hands released her as he uttered this cry, and went up to his white hair, which they tore in a frenzy. So he starts freaking out when she speaks. It died out, as everything but his shoemaking did die out of him, and he refolded his little packet and tried to secure it in his breast. But he still looked at her and gloomily shook his head. No, 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 you are too young, too blooming. It can't be. See what the prisoner is. These are not the hands she knew. This is not the face she knew. This is not a voice she ever heard. No, no, she was, and he was, before the slow years of the North Tower, ages ago. What is your name, my gentle angel? So that is so sad. He realizes that can't be his wife. It can't be. She's too young. She's too pretty. She's too blooming. It can't be. It can't be the wife. And he even references, like, even he isn't the same person. Like, they're gone. Hailing his softened tone and manner, his daughter fell upon her knees before him, with her appealing hands upon his breast. Oh, sir, at another time you shall know my name, and who my mother was, and who my father, and how I never knew their hard history. But I cannot tell you at this time, and I cannot tell you here. All that I may tell you here now is that I pray you to touch me and to bless me. Kiss me, oh my dear, my dear. His cold white head mingled with her radiant hair, which warmed and lighted it as though it were the light of freedom shining on him. If you hear in my voice, I don't know that it is so, but I hope it is. If you hear in my voice any resemblance to a voice that once was sweet music to your ears, weep for it, weep for it. If you touch, in touching my hair, anything that recalls a beloved head that lay upon your breast when you were young and free, weep for it, weep for it. If, when I hint to you of a home that is before us, where I will be true to you with all my duty and with all my faithful service, I bring back the resemblance of a home long desolate, while your poor heart pined away, weep for it, weep for it. And she held him closer round the neck and rocked him on her breast like a child. So, I mean, I don't know if any of y'all have little brothers or sisters, or if you have like little nieces or nephews or something, but when they're just heartbroken over something, and I mean, it may be a little kid something, but when they're just devastated and you pick them up and you hold them to your shoulder and your chest and you're just rocking them like, baby, it'll be okay. It will be okay. I'll make it all better. I promise it'll be okay. That's what she's doing to her father. She's like, if my voice reminds you of my mother's, just cry for it. If anything I do reminds you, like my hair reminds you, or whenever I hint about home, if any of that reminds you of the past, just weep for it. I'm going to make it better. I'm going to make everything better. If when I tell you, dearest dear, that your agony is over, and that I have come here to take you from it, and that we go to England to be at peace and at rest, I cause you to think of your useful life laid waste, and of our native France so wicked to you. Weep for it. Weep for it. And if, when I shall tell you of my name, and of my father who is living, and of my mother who is dead, and you learn that I have to kneel to my honored father, and implore his pardon for having never for his sake striven all day, and lain awake and wept all night, because the love of my poor mother hid his torture from me, weep for it. Weep for it. Weep for her then, and for me. Good gentlemen, thank God. I feel his sacred tears upon my face, and his sobs strike against my heart. Oh, see! Thank God for us! Thank God! He had sunk in her arms, and his face dropped on her breast. A sight so touching, yet so terrible in the tremendous wrong and suffering which it had gone before it, that the two beholders covered their faces. So she does, for a moment she kind of recalls him, and he does start crying. He does remember his past, and he starts crying for it. He's not that shoemaker for a moment, and he's crying over all he's lost and all he's about to gain. And she thanks God that that's happened, and Defarge and Laurie are standing back on the side, and they are so moved, they both start crying. Everyone in that room is crying. That's how emotional and horrific and just, I don't know, I guess happy and for the moment because she's about to bring him back to himself that the scene is. It's just too much. It is emotionally too much, and they all lose it. When the quiet of the garret had been long undisturbed, and his heaving breast and shaken form had long yielded to the calm that must follow all storms, emblem to humanity of the rest and silence into which the storm called life must hush at last, they came forward to raise the father and daughter from the ground. He had gradually dropped to the floor, and lay there in a lethargy, worn out. She had nestled down with him, that his head might lie upon her arm, and her hair drooping over him curtained him from the light. It's like she's protecting him. She's his shield from anything that might possibly hurt him. If, without disturbing him, she said, raising her hand to Mr. Lorry as he stooped over them, after repeated blowings of his nose, all could be arranged for our leaving Paris at once, so that from the very door he could be taken away. But consider, is he fit for the journey? Asked Mr. Lorry. More fit for that, I think, than to remain in this city so dreadful to him. It is true, said Defarge, who was kneeling to look on and hear. More than that, Monsieur Manet is, for all reasons, best out of France. Say, shall I hire a carriage and post horses? That's business, said Mr. Lorry, resuming on the shortest notice his methodical manners. And if business is to be done, I had better do it. That's what he knows, right? Then be so kind, urged Miss Manet, as to leave us here. You see how composed he has become, and you cannot be afraid to leave him with me now. Why should you be? If you will lock the door to secure us from interruption, I do not doubt that you will find him, when you come back, as quiet as you leave him. In any case, I will take care of him until you return, and then we will remove him straight. Both Mr. Lorry and Defarge were rather disinclined to this course, and in favor of one of them remaining. So they still don't trust him fully. They still think he might prove dangerous to her. She has no fear. She is his protector. She will take care of him. They can leave. They can lock the door. She's going to watch him. But as there were not only carriages and horses to be seen to, but traveling papers. And as time pressed for the day was drawing to an end, it came at last to their hastily dividing the business that was necessary to be done and hurrying away to do it. When it says, and traveling papers to be seen to, Defarge is going to go get some forged documents. You had to have traveling papers, right, to show you were legal in the country. So he's going to go take care of that on the shady side of things. Then, as the darkness closed in, the daughter laid her head down on the hard ground close at the father's side and watched him. The darkness deepened and deepened, and they both lay quiet until a light gleamed through the chinks in the wall. Oh, a light shining through the darkness. Could it be symbolic? I don't know. Mr. Lorry and Monsieur Defarge had made all ready for the journey, and had brought with them, besides, travelling cloaks and wrappers, bread and meat, wine, and hot coffee. Monsieur Defarge put this provender, and the lamp he carried, on the shoemaker's bench. There was nothing else in the garret but a pallet bed. And he and Mr. Lorry roused the captive, and assisted him to his feet. No human intelligence could have read the mysteries of his mind, in the scarce blank wonder of his face. Whether he knew what had happened, whether he recollected what they had said to him, whether he knew that he was free, were questions which no sagacity could have solved. So, it's basically like, there's no one on the planet, here or now. There's no one smart enough to know whether Dr. Manet knew what was going on, whether he even remembered 5 minutes ago what had happened, whether he comprehended that he was being free. No one, nothing could know if Dr. Manet was aware. Sagacity means wisdom, just so you know. They tried speaking to him, but he was so confused and so very slow to answer that they took fright at his bewilderment, and agreed for the time to tamper with him no more. He had a wild, lost manner of occasionally clasping his head in his hands that had not been seen in him before. Yet he had some pleasure in the mere sound of his daughter's voice, and invariably turned to it when she spoke. Okay, so they're freeing him, and he's so used to confinement that he starts going a little crazy at the thought of freedom. Like, he's looking around, he's like, I don't understand. He starts pulling at his hair like he's going to rip out his hair. And the only thing that makes him happy and that calms him down is Lucy, is her voice. In the submissive way of one long accustomed to obey under coercion, he ate and drank what they gave him to eat and drink, and put on the cloak and other wrappings that they gave him to wear. He readily responded to his daughter's drawing her arm through his, and took, and kept, her hand in both his own. They began to descend, Monsieur Defarge going first with the lamp, Mr. Lorry closing the little procession. They had not traversed many steps of the long main staircase when he stopped, and stared at the roof and round at the walls. You remember the place, my father? You remember coming up here? What did you say? But before she could repeat the question, he murmured an answer as if she had repeated it. Remember? No, I don't remember. It was so very long ago. Which it wasn't long ago when he was up there in the wine shop. He doesn't think he's in the wine shop right now. He thinks he's at the Bastille. And then when it talks about like their order, so Defarge is leading, he's in the front with the lamp, and then you have Lucy and Dr. Manet, and then Laurie's at the back. It's kind of one person in the front to help, one person in the back to help in case there's some kind of issue with him. That he had no recollection whatever of his having been brought from his prison to that house was apparent to them. They heard him mutter, 105 North Tower. And when he looked about him, it evidently was for the strong fortress walls which had long encompassed him. On their reaching the courtyard, he instinctively altered his tread, as being in expectation of a drawbridge. And when there was no drawbridge, and he saw the carriage waiting in the open street, he dropped his daughter's hand and clasped his head again. Okay. This is 100% a description of PTSD. He has post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, obviously, he's walking, he thinks he's back in the past. Whenever something comes into his mind that isn't what he expects, he starts losing it and pulling out his hair and just like he can't handle it. He can't. No crowd was about the door. No people were discernible in any of the many windows. Not even a chance passerby was in the street. An unnatural silence and desertion reigned there. Only one soul was to be seen, and that was Madame Defarge, who leaned against the doorpost, knitting, and saw nothing. Okay, it's an unnatural silence and desertion. Okay, it's not like there are normally no people there. It's unnatural. Why would the street be deserted? Why wouldn't there be anyone there? Madame Defarge got rid of them. She's the only one there standing, just knitting as if nothing in the world is strange or different, but everything is different and weird and unnatural. She told everybody to go, and they scattered. It's as if a cat walked in and snapped its little paws and the mice went psh. She walks in and says, everybody out. Everybody leaves. Nobody messes with Madame Defarge. I love her. The prisoner had got into a coach, and his daughter had followed him, when Mr. Lorry's feet were arrested on the step by his asking, miserably, for his shoemaking tools and the unfinished shoes. It's so sad. He wants the symbol of his imprisonment with him. I mean, it's just like, oh, tears. Madame Defarge immediately called to her husband that she would get them, and went, knitting, out of the lamplight through the courtyard. Okay, if she saw nothing and wasn't paying attention, how'd she hear that? How'd she know it was asked? She's watching this whole thing. She knows exactly what's going on. She quickly brought them down and handed them in, and immediately afterwards leaned against the doorpost, knitting, and saw nothing. Defarge got upon the box and gave the word, to the barrier. The postilion cracked his whip, and they clattered away under the feeble overswinging lamps. Under the overswinging lamps, swinging ever brighter in the better streets, and ever dimmer in the worse, and by-lighted shops, gay crowds, illuminated coffee-houses, and theater doors to one of the city's gates. Soldiers with lanterns at the guard-house there. Your papers, travellers. See here, then, monsieur the officer, said Defarge, getting down and taking him gravely apart. These are the papers of monsieur inside, with the white head. They were consigned to me with him at the giant dash. He dropped his voice. There was a flutter among the military lanterns, and one of them being handed into the coach by an arm in uniform. The eyes connected with the arm looked, not an everyday or an every night look, at monsieur with the white head. It is well. Forward, from the uniform. Adieu, from Defarge. And so, under a short grove of feebler and feebler overswinging lamps, out under the great groves of stars. Okay, so this army guy is going to be one of the revolutionaries too, obviously. I mean, Defarge pulls him aside, starts whispering to him. That guy goes and looks at Dr. Manet the same way those three Jacques went and looked at Dr. Manet. And he's like, yeah, it's all good here. Go ahead. Go ahead. Beneath that arc of unmoving and eternal lights, which is just a beautiful way of saying beneath the stars. Some so remote from this little earth that the learned tell us it is doubtful whether their rays have even yet discovered it. As a point in space where anything is suffered or done. The shadows of the night were broad and black. All through the cold and restless intervals until dawn, they once more whispered in the ears of Mr. Jarvis Lorry, sitting opposite the buried man who had been dug out, and wondering what subtle powers were forever lost to him and what were capable of restoration. The old inquiry, I hope you care to be recalled to life. And the old answer, I can't say. Okay, so you remember the chapter earlier that was called The Shadows of the Night, whenever Mr. Lorry was having all those dreams about, digging someone out of a grave? Again, Dickens alludes back to that chapter, and he talks about the shadows of the night, and Mr. Lorry is again having that same kind of dream, except now his buried man is right in front of him. He's like, I hope you care to be recalled to life, right? I hope you care to live. I hope you care to come back to yourself. And he still has that vision of him saying, I can't say. I don't know. I don't know if I want to live. And that, beautifully, is the ending of book 1. Okay, I know book the first is kind of slow because it's all exposition and setting things up. But you get more of the character development towards those last few chapters. And starting in book 2, it's much more of a story instead of setting up with everything. You get characters, there's more dialogue, and it's a lot easier to understand. Okay, so you're really going to love book 2. Book 1's a little slow, I get it. But book 2, man, I'm telling you, this story is magic. So, yeah, the end. Good luck on the quiz.